The rain hammered down on the September streets as I trudged home at 3 in the morning, my scrubs still damp with sweat, and God knows what else from the double shift that had finally ended. My feet ached in shoes that needed replacing 6 months ago, and my shoulders carried the weight of 16 hours in the emergency room, where I had watched 2 patients die, despite everything I could do, and saved 3 others who would never know my name. The bus had stopped running an hour ago, and I could not afford an Uber, not with rent due in 3 days, and my brother's tuition payment looming like a storm cloud over my nearly empty bank account. So I walked through streets that smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes, past closed storefronts with metal gates pulled down like eyelids, steam rising from grates in ghostly tendrils that dissolved into the downpour. I should have been paying more attention to my surroundings. Should have noticed the black Mercedes speeding through the intersection 2 blocks ahead, but exhaustion had turned my brain into something slow and fuzzy until the screech of tires cut through the rain's monotonous drumming and the sickening crunch of metal against concrete snapped me into alertness. The Mercedes had slammed into a lamppost with enough force to shatter the windshield into a spiderweb of cracks, the front end crumpled like paper, and through the rain I could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel, unmoving. No other cars stopped, no other pedestrians appeared on this deserted stretch of road, just me and the wreckage and the person inside who might be dying while I stood frozen on the sidewalk. Then my medical training overrode every instinct screaming at me to keep walking, to not get involved, to protect myself first, and I found myself running toward the car, my worn sneakers splashing through puddles, rain soaking through my thin jacket. I wrenched open the driver's door, and the dome light revealed a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, dark hair plastered to his forehead, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, blood streaming from a deep laceration across his temple and matting in his hair. His pulse was there but weakening, his breathing shallow, and blood mixed with rainwater dripped onto the leather seats that smelled of expensive cologne and copper. I yanked off my scarf, the cheap cotton one I had worn every winter for 5 years, and pressed it against the wound, applying pressure the way I had done 1,000 times in the emergency room, my hands steady despite the trembling starting in my chest. "Come on," I whispered, or maybe I shouted. I could not tell over the rain and the sirens somewhere in the distance that never seemed to get closer. "Stay with me. Don't you dare die on this street. Not tonight, not on my watch." I was checking his neck for spinal injuries, my fingers gentle but methodical along the vertebrae, when the night exploded with the screech of tires, and suddenly, 3 black SUVs surrounded the wreckage, their headlights cutting through the rain like knives, blinding me. 6 men poured out before the vehicles even fully stopped, all wearing dark suits that stretched across shoulders built for violence, and every single one of them had a gun drawn and pointed in my general direction. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I did not move from my position, crouched beside the injured man, my scarf still pressed against his bleeding temple, my other hand supporting his neck, because moving him incorrectly could paralyze or kill him. "Step away from him," the largest of the men barked, his accent thick with something Eastern European, his gun never wavering as he approached. "Now." The others fanned out in a tactical formation I recognized from movies, from news reports about things that happened to other people in other neighborhoods, and the metallic smell of blood mixed with rain and gunpowder residue, and my own fear sweat. "He has a traumatic brain injury, and I'm a doctor," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, loud enough to carry over the rain. "So unless you want him dead, you will let me do my job." The lead guard hesitated, his eyes flicking to the man in the car, then back to me, and I saw him processing whether I was a threat or an asset, whether killing me would solve a problem or create one. Red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement from somewhere blocks away, sirens that might be coming this way or might be heading somewhere else entirely. And the whole scene felt surreal, like I had stepped through a membrane into a different reality where doctors got guns pointed at them for trying to save lives. Then the injured man stirred beneath my hands, a groan escaping his lips, and his eyes opened for the first time. They were the most striking ice blue I had ever seen, pale and clear even through the haze of pain and blood loss, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, like he was asking me something without words, and his lips moved in a whisper I had to lean close to hear. Fidarsi di lei, he breathed, the Italian words soft and slurred, his hand lifting weakly toward my face before it fell back. Mio Angelo. Then his eyes rolled back and he went limp again, unconscious, and I felt panic surge because his pulse was getting weaker and we were wasting time with this standoff when he needed a hospital. The lead guard was on his phone now, speaking rapid Italian into it, and the other men lowered their weapons slightly, but did not holster them, their eyes scanning the surrounding buildings and streets like they expected an attack at any moment. Whatever world I had stumbled into by stopping at this crash, it was not one where people called ambulances or trusted the police. The lead guard spoke into his phone in rapid Italian, words tumbling over each other too fast for me to catch more than a few syllables, his eyes never leaving me as rain streamed down his face and plastered his dark hair against his skull. The sirens were getting closer now, multiple vehicles converging from different directions, and I could see the tension ratcheting up in the way the other men shifted their positions and scanned the rooftops of surrounding buildings like they expected snipers. "We take him to private facility," the lead guard said when he ended the call, his English heavily accented but clear. "You come with us. Make sure he lives." It was not a request, and every instinct I had screamed that getting into a vehicle with armed men was how people disappeared, how bodies ended up in rivers. But the man in the car was dying, and that mattered more than my fear. "No," I said, standing up slowly with my hands visible, trying to project a confidence I absolutely did not feel. "He needs a CT scan to check for brain bleeding. He possibly needs surgery. That means a hospital with an imaging suite and an operating room. Your private facility does not have those things." The guard's jaw tightened and his hand moved fractionally toward his weapon, and I knew I was pushing into dangerous territory, but I also knew I was right. "I don't care who he is," I continued, my voice getting stronger. "He needs a hospital or he dies. Choose." The standoff stretched between us, rain hammering down harder now, turning the street into a river, the distant sirens close enough that I could distinguish individual vehicles. Then the man in the car stirred again, another groan escaping him, and the lead guard's attention snapped back to his boss. "Her," the injured man whispered, his ice-blue eyes opening again and finding me through the chaos and the rain and the guns. "Trust her." His hand lifted toward me again, trembling with effort, and something passed between us in that moment, some recognition I could not name. The guard's expression shifted, and I saw the exact moment he made his choice, when his boss's life became more important than whatever protocol I was violating. "We go to hospital," he said finally, "but you ride with us. You do not leave his side until he is stable." "My hospital," I countered, because if I was doing this, I needed the home advantage, the staff who knew me, the security cameras and witnesses. "Mercy General, 5 blocks from here. I work in the emergency room. They know me, and they will not ask questions they should not ask." The guard considered this, spoke briefly into his phone again, then nodded sharply. "Marco," he said, gesturing to himself. "You save him, doctor. You save him or nothing else matters." 2 of his men were already carefully extracting the injured man from the wreckage, supporting his head and neck the way I had shown them with quick hand gestures, and I found myself being guided firmly toward one of the SUVs, the door held open like I was an honored guest rather than a potential hostage. The emergency room at Mercy General erupted into controlled chaos. The moment we burst through the doors, Marco and his men carrying the injured man on a stretcher they had produced from somewhere, and I was shouting orders before the staff even registered what was happening. "Trauma Bay 2!" I called out, my voice cutting through the normal midnight lull. "Head injury, possible skull fracture, GCS of 8. And I need a CT scan ordered now. The nurses knew me well enough not to question the armed men in expensive suits who took up positions outside the bay, their hands resting on weapons barely concealed beneath tailored jackets. But I saw the looks they exchanged as harsh fluorescent lights revealed the patient's face. Sarah, the head nurse who had worked here longer than I had been alive, went pale and grabbed my arm as I was scrubbing blood off my hands at the sink. "Do you know who that is?" she hissed, her eyes wide. "That is Dante Salvatore." I looked at her blankly because the name meant nothing to me, nothing except that it sounded Italian and expensive and matched the suit he wore. "I don't care if he is the president," I said, snapping on fresh gloves. "He is my patient and he is dying, so either help me or get out of my way." She helped, because Sarah was a professional, but her hands shook as she cut away his blood-soaked shirt, and I could hear whispers spreading through the ER like wildfire. I focused on what I knew, on the medicine, on the neat row of sutures I placed across the deep laceration on his temple, on the CT scan that blessedly showed no brain bleed, just significant swelling. Marco stood in the corner speaking urgently into his phone in Italian, and I caught fragments between the beeping of monitors and the organized chaos of treatment. "Assassination attempt," he said, "and Kozlov family, and how many men do we have at the estate?" My hand started shaking then, a fine tremor I could not control as reality crashed over me like a wave. I had not just saved someone injured in a car accident, I had saved someone important enough to assassinate, someone with estates and armed guards and enemies who crashed cars into lampposts. But my hand steadied when I looked down and found those ice-blue eyes open again, watching me work with an intensity that made my breath catch. He was semi-conscious, floating in and out, but every time he surfaced his gaze found mine, and held it like I was an anchor in rough seas. Something passed between us each time our eyes met, some wordless communication I did not understand but felt in my chest, and I found myself leaning closer than strictly necessary when I checked his pupils, found my fingers gentler than usual when I palpated the swelling around his wound. Dawn was breaking over the city when I finally finished my shift, the real one and the unexpected trauma that had consumed the last 3 hours, and Marco offered me a ride home in one of those black SUVs that now made my skin crawl. I refused because I wanted nothing more to do with Dante Salvatore or his world of assassination attempts and armed guards, wanted to walk away and pretend this night had never happened, so I walked the 15 blocks to my apartment building while the city slowly woke around me. Delivery trucks rumbled past, their exhaust mixing with the smell of rain-washed pavement, and early morning commuters hurried toward subway stations with their heads down and their coffee cups clutched like lifelines, and none of them knew that I had just saved the life of someone important enough to kill. My apartment building looked even more depressing in the pale morning light, the brick facade water-stained and crumbling, graffiti tags layered over older graffiti tags, windows covered with bars that were supposed to make us feel safe, but only reminded us we lived somewhere that needed them. I climbed the 4 flights because the elevator had been broken since August, my legs heavy with exhaustion, and let myself into the tiny studio that was home. Jake was asleep on the couch that doubled as his bed, my 19-year-old brother, who I had raised since our parents died when he was 13, and I was barely an adult myself, his textbooks scattered around him and his laptop still open to some engineering assignment. Bills covered the small table where we ate our meals, a mountain of envelopes I had been avoiding. Medical school debt that I would be paying until I was 50, Jake's tuition for the state school that was all we could afford, rent that was already 5 days overdue, electricity and water and internet, and the endless parade of costs that never stopped coming. I stood under the shower until the hot water ran out, watching blood swirl down the drain. Dante's blood mixed with the blood of the patients I had treated during my regular shift, and my hands shook so badly I had to brace them against the tile wall. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I did not recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were too wide, her face too pale, her expression haunted by the weight of choices that might destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. "What did you just do?" I whispered to my reflection, my voice barely audible over the clanking radiator and the sounds of the city waking up outside my thin curtains. What did you get yourself into? But there were no answers in the mirror, no guidance from the universe, just my own face, and the knowledge that I had crossed some invisible line tonight. I collapsed onto my bed, still damp from the shower, not bothering to dry off or put on proper pajamas, and sleep dragged me under like a riptide. The thunderous noise invaded my sleep like an earthquake, a mechanical roar that shook the windows in their frames and sent vibrations through the mattress beneath me, and I jolted awake disoriented and terrified as the sound grew impossibly louder. Jake was already at the window, his face pressed against the glass, and when I stumbled over to join him, my heart simply stopped. Two black helicopters were descending onto the street outside our building, massive, military-looking things with rotors that whipped the air into a frenzy, sending trash and papers swirling in violent spirals, and cars screeched to a halt as the helicopters settled onto the asphalt like predatory birds claiming territory. Armed men in tactical gear poured out before the skids even fully touched down, their movements precise and coordinated, fanning out to secure a perimeter around our building with the kind of efficiency that spoke of serious training. Every window in every apartment building on the block was suddenly filled with faces, neighbors pressing against glass, pulling out phones to record, and I could hear muffled shouts and sirens starting up somewhere in the distance. "Maya," Jake said, and his voice cracked with fear, because my baby brother had never seen anything like this, had never been touched by violence or danger in his careful college student life that I had worked so hard to give him. "What the hell did you do?" The rotor wash was creating a windstorm that rattled our windows, and through the chaos I saw Marco emerging from the lead helicopter, his suit somehow still immaculate despite the turbulence, flanked by 4 men who moved like soldiers. "I saved someone's life," I heard myself say, my voice distant and strange. "That's all. Just saved a life." But even as I said it, I knew it was not all. Knew that saving Dante Salvatore had been the first domino in a chain reaction I could not stop, and terror flooded through me cold and absolute. This was an overwhelming show of force. Helicopters landing in a residential neighborhood in broad daylight, armed men securing the perimeter like they were extracting a head of state, and it was all for me. Marco was looking up at our building now, speaking into a radio, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that he was coming for me. I should have felt only fear, should have been planning escape routes or calling the police. But beneath the terror was something else I did not want to examine too closely. A strange anticipation, a flutter in my chest when I thought about seeing those ice-blue eyes again, and I hated myself for it. Jake grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "We need to run," he said. "Maya, we need to get out of here right now." But there was nowhere to run. Not from helicopters and armed men and whatever world I had stumbled into when I pulled over on a rain-slicked street. The knock on my door came exactly 3 minutes after the helicopters landed, sharp and authoritative. And I knew before I opened it that running was not an option anymore. Marco stood in my doorway with 6 men flanking him, their tactical gear somehow making the cramped hallway look even smaller, and his expression was professionally courteous in a way that made clear this was not a social call. "Mr. Salvatore wishes to thank you personally for saving his life," he said, his accent slightly softer in the daylight than it had been on that rain-soaked street. "He has sent transportation to bring you to his estate." I tried to refuse, tried to explain that I had just been doing my job and needed no thanks, that I had a shift at the hospital in 6 hours, and a brother to take care of and a life that did not include helicopter rides to estates, but Marco's expression never changed. "This is not optional, Dr. Chen," he said quietly, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone. "There are people who saw you help Mr. Salvatore last night, traffic cameras, witnesses, security footage from surrounding buildings. These people want to know who you are and whether you know anything that could be valuable." My blood went cold because I understood what he was not saying, that I had painted a target on my back the moment I pressed my scarf against Dante's bleeding temple. Marco pulled out a tablet and swiped through a series of photographs that made my stomach drop. Russian men with hard faces watching my building from a car across the street, the same men following Jake across the college campus, close enough to touch him. The photos were time-stamped from this morning, from an hour ago, from 20 minutes ago. You saved his life, Marco continued, his voice gentle like he was explaining something to a child. That makes you valuable to his enemies. They will come for you to learn what you know, to use you as leverage, to punish Mr. Salvatore through you. He is offering you sanctuary, protection, a chance to survive what you accidentally stepped into. That is a pretty word for kidnapping, I said. But my voice shook because Jake was standing behind me, and those men in the photos had been close enough to hurt him. Marco's expression flickered with something that might have been respect. Mr. Salvatore does not kidnap, he said. He protects. You have a choice, Dr. Chen. Come with us now. Accept his protection and his gratitude. Or stay here and wait for men far less courteous than I am to come asking questions you cannot answer. My cramped apartment suddenly felt like a cage, the walls closing in, and I looked at Jake's frightened face and knew I had already lost this fight. How long? I asked, hating how defeated I sounded. How long do I have to stay? Marco's silence was answer enough. The helicopter ride was 45 minutes of pure sensory overload, the city falling away beneath us as we flew north over suburbs that gradually gave way to forests painted in autumn colors, reds and golds and oranges that looked like the world was on fire. I kept Jake pressed against my side in the leather seat that probably cost more than our monthly rent, his hand gripping mine so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers and tried not to think about how high we were or how completely we had left behind everything familiar. Through the window I watched the landscape transform into something that belonged in magazines rather than real life. And then the estate appeared below us like a vision from another world entirely. It sprawled across what must have been hundreds of acres along a private lake that reflected the sky like polished silver. The main house, a massive modern Italian villa of glass and stone that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, all clean lines and sophisticated angles. Multiple outbuildings dotted the perfectly manicured grounds, guest houses maybe, or barracks for the security personnel I could see patrolling in pairs, and reflecting pools caught the sunlight in blinding flashes. We descended toward a private helipad marked with a gleaming H, and as we got closer, I could see the true scale of the security. Guards stationed at regular intervals along the perimeter wall that I had not even noticed from altitude, cameras mounted on every building, what looked like a full tactical response team waiting near the helipad. This was not a home, this was a compound, a fortress designed to keep the world out and whoever lived inside completely isolated and protected. This is not protection, I said to Marco as the helicopter settled onto the pad and the rotors began to slow. This is a fortress. He helped me out onto solid ground, his hand steady under my elbow, and gestured toward the main house where walls of glass reflected the autumn landscape and promised transparency while revealing nothing. In Mr. Salvatore's world, he said simply, there is no difference. Jake stumbled out behind me, his eyes wide as he took in the scope of what we had entered, and I felt simultaneously awed and terrified because this level of wealth and power was beyond anything I had ever imagined. The air here smelled different, cleaner somehow, pine and fresh water and expensive landscaping, no exhaust fumes or trash, or the dense urban smell I had lived with my entire life. I could not belong here. Could not imagine walking through those glass walls into a world that operated by rules I did not understand. But Marco was already guiding us forward, and the choice had been taken from me. Marco led me through halls that felt more like an art gallery than a home, past paintings I recognized from textbooks and sculptures that belonged in museums, until we reached a heavy wooden door that he opened without knocking. The study beyond was aggressively masculine, all dark wood and leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes that looked actually read rather than decorative, and afternoon light streaming through tall windows that overlooked the lake. Classical music played softly from speakers I could not see, something Italian and melancholy, and the room smelled of expensive bourbon and old books and power. Dante Salvatore stood near the windows with his back to us, and when he turned, I felt my breath catch despite everything. He was a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, younger than I had realized in the chaos of last night, with dark hair that fell perfectly across his forehead and bone structure that belonged on magazine covers. A white bandage covered the wound I had stitched, stark against his olive skin, but he looked remarkably healthy considering he had nearly died 12 hours ago. Those ice-blue eyes found mine immediately and held, and I felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice a low rumble with an Italian accent that wrapped around my name like silk. "Please, sit." I remained standing because sitting felt like surrender, and Jake pressed close behind me like he could disappear into my shadow. Dante's lips curved in something that might have been amusement, and he moved to his desk where he withdrew a leather portfolio. "I owe you my life," he said, opening the portfolio to reveal a check already written out. "This is inadequate compensation, but it is a start. $500,000. The number made my visions swim. More money than I would make in 5 years. Enough to pay off my medical school debt, and Jake's tuition, and our rent for the next decade. I could not take it, could not accept payment for doing what any doctor would have done. I was just doing my job," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I do not want your money." Something flickered in his expression, surprise maybe or respect, and he set the check down carefully. "Everyone wants something, Dr. Chen," he said, moving around the desk until he was too close. Close enough that I could smell cedar and leather, and something metallic like gunpowder. "What do you want?" "To go home and forget this ever happened?" I said, meeting his gaze even though it made my heart race. Dante's expression shifted into something almost regretful, and he reached out slowly like he was giving me time to pull away, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I am afraid that is the one thing I cannot give you," he said softly, and the words felt like a prison door closing. Dante returned to his desk and pulled out a folder that he spread open before me, and what I saw made my stomach turn to ice. Traffic camera footage from last night showed me crouched beside the wrecked Mercedes, my face clearly visible in the harsh streetlight as I pressed my scarf against his bleeding temple. And there were more photos from different angles, different cameras, a complete timeline of my involvement. "The Kozlov family orchestrated the crash," Dante said, his voice clinical, like he was discussing a business transaction rather than attempted murder. "Russian bratva, very territorial, very violent. We have been in dispute over shipping routes through the port for the past 18 months, and they decided to resolve it permanently." He gestured to another set of photos, men with hard Slavic features and expensive suits. "They failed to kill me, but they succeeded in creating a different problem." His finger tapped my face in the traffic camera image. "They know someone helped me, someone who kept me alive long enough for Marco to arrive, and they have identified you." My legs simply gave out and I sank into the leather chair behind me, the weight of reality crushing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Jake made a small sound of distress, and I reached for his hand blindly, needing the contact to anchor me. "You are saying that because I saved your life, I am now a target," I said, and anger flared hot beneath the fear. "That my brother is in danger because I stopped to help someone bleeding in a car." Dante's expression remained carefully neutral, but I saw something flicker in those ice-blue eyes. Regret maybe, or guilt. "I did not ask you to save me," he said quietly. "But since you did, I will not allow you to die for it. The Kozlov family will come for you to learn what you know, to use you as leverage against me, to send a message that helping me carries consequences." How noble, I said, my voice sharp with fear disguised as sarcasm. You will protect me from danger that exists because of you. Marco shifted at the door, his hand moving fractionally toward his weapon, but Dante held up a hand to stop him. She has every right to be angry, he said, still watching me with that unsettling intensity. If our positions were reversed, I would burn this entire estate to the ground. But anger will not change the reality, Dr. Chen. You are in danger, your brother is in danger, and I am offering you the only protection that will keep you both alive. The intelligence photos spread across his desk showed more than just me at the crash site. They showed the layout of my apartment building, Jake's route to campus, every vulnerable point in our lives laid bare. Dante was being honest, brutally so, and somehow that made it worse. Rosa appeared like a spirit summoned from the very walls, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked black hair, pulled into an elegant bun, and eyes that held warmth despite the circumstances, and she guided us to a guest suite that made my cramped apartment look like a storage closet. The sitting room alone was larger than our entire living space back home, decorated in soft creams and blues with furniture that probably cost more than I made in a year, and through double doors I could see two separate bedrooms, each with its own marble bathroom that gleamed like something from a luxury hotel. Jake's enthusiasm broke through his fear almost immediately as he explored, his voice echoing back about the rain shower, and the heated floors, and the television that rose from a cabinet at the foot of the bed. "This place is insane," he called out. "Have you seen the pool from the window?" "It is a prison," I said quietly, moving to test the window locks and finding them secure, reinforced glass that would not break easily. A beautiful prison. Rosa was hanging clothes in the walk-in closet, designer labels in exactly our sizes, which meant Dante had somehow acquired our measurements, and when she turned, her expression was gentle but firm. "Mr. Salvatore does not keep prisoners," she said in accented English that reminded me of my grandmother. "He keeps people safe. There is a difference." I wanted to argue, but she left before I could form the words, closing the door softly behind her and leaving us in our gilded cage with its view of the lake where sunset was painting the sky in oranges and pinks. I spent the next hour exploring boundaries, walking the suite's perimeter like I was doing rounds at the hospital, noting the cameras in the hallway outside, the guards positioned at regular intervals who nodded respectfully but did not move from their posts. I ventured downstairs and outside onto the grounds, testing how far I could go before someone politely redirected me, mapping guard positions and camera angles with the clinical precision I usually reserved for diagnosing complex cases. Escape would be difficult, but not impossible, I decided, noting the wall height and the blind spots in camera coverage and the timing of guard rotations. My medical mind was analyzing the situation like a puzzle that needed solving, looking for weaknesses in the security that kept us safe and trapped in equal measure. Jake found me by the reflecting pool where Koi swam in lazy circles, his face flushed with excitement that made him look younger than 19. "Maya, there is a gym with equipment I have only seen in magazines," he said, "and Rosa said we can order anything we want for dinner." "This is not a vacation," I reminded him, but my voice lacked conviction because the alternative to this luxury was those Russian men from the photos, and I knew which I preferred. Dinner was served in a dining room that somehow managed to feel intimate despite being large enough to seat 20. Candles flickering in silver holders that cast dancing shadows across walls hung with more museum-quality art, and it was just the two of us, because Jake had eaten earlier and retreated to his room, overwhelmed by everything. A private chef appeared with courses that were works of art on china so delicate I was afraid to cut into the food. Italian wine that probably cost more than my monthly salary. And Mozart played softly from hidden speakers, while rain began to tap against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Dante had changed into dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle, and a watch that gleamed gold in the candlelight, and I hated that I noticed. hated that my eyes kept drifting to his hands as he held his wine glass, or the way his mouth curved when he spoke. He asked me about my life with genuine curiosity, wanting to know how I had ended up raising my brother alone and why I had chosen emergency medicine, and I found myself answering honestly despite my intention to maintain distance. I told him about my parents dying in a car accident when Jake was 13 and I was barely 22, about dropping out of medical school for 2 years to work 3 jobs until I could afford to go back, about choosing the emergency room because I liked the immediacy of it, the way you could see the direct result of your actions. You could have walked past my car, Dante said, his ice blue eyes holding mine across the table. Most would have. I took an oath, I replied. But even as I said it, I knew it was more than that. Knew that some compulsion in me could not ignore suffering even when stopping might destroy my life. And I took a different kind of oath, he said, leaning back in his chair with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. We both live by codes, Dr. Chen. Perhaps we are not so different. I asked him about his world then, expecting evasion or lies, but he was surprisingly candid as courses came and went. He spoke of inheriting his father's business at 24, of the violence and compromise required to survive, of his attempts to legitimize operations and build something beyond the blood and territory disputes. He was intelligent in a way I had not expected, quoting Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, discussing philosophy and art, with the ease of someone who had actually read the books lining his study, rather than just collecting them for show. The physical awareness between us built with each passing minute, a tension that crackled in the candlelit space like electricity, and I caught myself watching the way his throat moved when he drank wine, the strength in his fingers as he gestured while speaking. Rain intensified outside, drumming against glass, and I felt trapped not just by the estate, but by the pull I felt toward this dangerous man who should terrify me, but instead made me feel more alive than I had in years. Sleep would not come no matter how many times I turned over in sheets that felt like clouds. And at 2 in the morning, I gave up and slipped out of the guest suite to explore the darkened house. The hallways were lit only by subtle floor lighting that made everything feel dreamlike and unreal, and I moved quietly past rooms I had not seen during my earlier exploration. A library that smelled of old leather, a conservatory where plants cast strange shadows, until I saw light spilling from beneath the door of Dante's study. I should have returned to my room, but instead, I pushed the door open and found him still at his desk, papers scattered before him, and a single lamp casting harsh shadows across his face. He was holding his head in his hands, and even from across the room, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he pressed his fingers against his temple near the bandage I had applied. My doctor instincts overrode everything else, and I crossed to him without thinking, my hand reaching for his face before I could stop myself. "You should be resting," I said softly, and he startled at my touch but did not pull away. "Head injuries are serious, and you nearly died 12 hours ago." "So are assassination attempts," he replied, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "I cannot afford to rest when the Kozlov family is planning their next move." But his eyes closed as my fingers carefully peeled back the bandage, checking for signs of infection or bleeding, and I felt his warmth beneath my touch, the intimacy of being this close to him in the quiet darkness. The wound looked good, no redness or swelling beyond what was normal, but I could see the tension lines around his mouth that spoke of significant pain he was hiding. "I need to change this dressing," I said, and he nodded slightly, leaning into my touch in a way that made my heart race. There was first aid supplies in a drawer that Rosa must have stocked, and I worked carefully to clean the area and apply fresh bandages, my fingers gentle on his skin, hyper-aware of every point of contact between us. Dante's hand came up to catch my wrist, not pulling me away, but holding me there, his thumb resting against my pulse point where it hammered against his touch. "Why did you save me, Maya?" he asked, using my first name for the first time, and the sound of it in his accented voice sent electricity down my spine. The truth. The moment stretched between us, charged with something I did not want to name. Rain drumming against windows and shadows pooling in corners. Nothing existing beyond his study and his warmth under my fingers and the vulnerability in his ice blue eyes. I could not walk past someone dying, I whispered, knowing it was not the whole truth, but not ready to examine what the whole truth might be. The truth spilled out of me like blood from a wound I had been holding closed for 2 years. Words I had never said aloud, tumbling into the quiet darkness of his study. I had a fiancé, I said, my voice breaking on the past tense. David. We were both in medical school, planning our lives together, planning everything, and then one night, while I was working an ER shift, a drunk driver ran a red light, and I could not save him. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Tears I had held back through his funeral and the collapse of all my careful plans and the endless months of just surviving afterward, and I felt them track down my face as I continued speaking. He was brought to my emergency room, and I tried everything, every procedure I knew, every desperate measure, but he died on my table while I was covered in his blood, and I have never forgiven myself for failing him. Dante's expression transformed, all the hardness melting away to reveal something raw and understanding, and he stood slowly and pulled me into his arms with a gentleness I had not expected from a man who commanded assassins. I see him in every patient, I whispered against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady beneath my cheek. Every time I fail to save someone, he dies again. And every time I succeed, I wonder if I am just trying to rewrite that night over and over. Now I cannot walk past anyone who needs help because what if they are someone's David? What if someone is waiting for them the way I waited? What if I could make a difference? Dante's hand stroked my hair, the gesture soothing and protective, and he held me while I cried in a way I had not let myself cry since the funeral. You did not fail him, he said softly, his accent thickening with emotion. You cannot save everyone, Kara, no matter how skilled you are or how desperately you try, but you saved me. His arms tightened around me and I felt safe in a way that made no sense. Safe in the embrace of a man who lived by violence, who had enemies hunting him, who had disrupted my entire life. The shift between us was palpable, no longer captor and captive, but two people who understood loss and guilt and the weight of carrying the dead. I pulled back to look at his face and saw my own pain reflected in those ice-blue eyes, saw that he knew exactly what it meant to replay a death over and over, searching for the moment you could have changed everything. We stood like that in his study, with rain falling outside and shadows pooling around us, two damaged people finding unexpected understanding, and something fundamental changed in that moment, some barrier dissolving that I had not even realized existed between us. Dante guided me to the leather sofa near the fireplace where embers still glowed faintly, and we sat close enough that our shoulders touched, sharing warmth in the quiet darkness that felt separate from the rest of the world. My father built this business from nothing, he said, his voice low and distant, like he was speaking from memory rather than to me. Started legitimate with shipping and imports, but there were necessary compromises to survive, payments to the right people, alliances with the wrong ones, and by the time I was old enough to understand what he had become, it was too late to go back. He inherited at 24 when rivals decided his father had grown too powerful, too influential, and they murdered him at a supposed peace negotiation, poison in his wine, while Dante waited at home. I took over everything that night, he continued, his hands clasped between his knees. The business, the territory, the blood feuds I had not started but was expected to finish, and I thought I could handle it, thought I was strong enough and smart enough to protect everyone who mattered. His voice cracked slightly, and I reached for his hand without thinking, lacing my fingers through his. My sister Sophia was 16, innocent, nothing to do with any of this, and she died because I was not careful enough about which enemies I made. She was caught in crossfire outside her school, targeted to send me a message, and I held her while she bled out on the pavement the same way you held me on that street. The parallel was so clear it hurt, both of us haunted by people we could not save, both of us carrying guilt like stones in our chests. I have built an empire on the foundation of her grave, Dante said, turning to look at me with those ice-blue eyes that held years of pain. Everything I do, every ruthless decision, every compromise with my conscience is to ensure no one else I care for dies that way. He paused, and his thumb traced circles on my palm. Until yesterday, I thought I had stopped caring for anyone. Dawn was starting to break outside the windows, pale light creeping across the grounds and turning the lake silver, and in that liminal space between night and morning, we sat with our shared grief laid bare between us. I understood him then in a way I had not before, understood that his fortress and his guards and his violence were all armor against the helplessness of watching someone die. The same helplessness that drove me to stop at every accident and treat every patient like they were David. We were kindred spirits in our damage, both trying to save the world, to atone for the one person we could not save, and the recognition that passed between us felt like coming home after a long exile. His hand tightened on mine and I leaned into him, our foreheads touching, breathing the same air, two broken people finding unexpected wholeness in shared understanding. The alarm shattered the quiet intimacy of dawn like glass exploding, a blaring electronic scream that sent adrenaline flooding through my system before my brain even processed what was happening. Dante was on his feet instantly, the vulnerable man who had shared his grief vanishing as completely as smoke, replaced by something cold and lethal, and absolutely terrifying. He had his phone out and was speaking rapid Italian, his voice clipped with command, and through the windows I could see movement on the grounds as his security forces mobilized. "What is happening?" I asked, my voice high with panic, and he turned to me with eyes that had gone flat and emotionless. "They are coming for me," he said, his hand closing around my wrist and pulling me toward the door. "But they will not reach you, I promise." The sound of gunfire erupted somewhere outside, sharp cracks that echoed across the lake, and Dante was moving me through the house at a run, down a hallway I had not explored, through a door concealed in the paneling that opened onto stairs descending into darkness. The safe room was all concrete and steel, a high-tech bunker that looked like something from a spy movie, with monitors covering one wall showing multiple camera feeds of the grounds where muzzle flashes lit the pre-dawn darkness like fireflies. Jake was already there with Rosa, his face white with terror, and I pulled him against me as Dante moved to the monitors and began issuing orders into a radio. Marco's voice crackled back with updates about breach points and engagement zones and casualty counts that made my stomach turn. "Eliminate all threats," Dante said into the radio, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "No survivors." I stared at him and saw the man he truly was beneath the cultured exterior, the killer who had built an empire on violence. And it should have terrified me, but instead, I felt an odd sense of reassurance because this ruthlessness was what stood between me and the men trying to breach his walls. On the monitors, I watched his security forces engage the attackers with tactical precision, watched bodies fall and blood bloom dark on manicured grass, and the reality of his world crashed over me with the weight of concrete. This was not protection in the abstract. This was men dying because I had stopped to help someone bleeding in a car, and I could not look away from the screens even as Jake buried his face against my shoulder. Dante stood rigid before the monitors, his jaw tight, calling out coordinates and commands with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, who would do it again, and I understood then that loving him would mean accepting this violence as the price of his protection. The all clear came 30 minutes later, but I was already pushing past Dante toward the stairs, my doctor training overriding fear and common sense, because wounded men needed help, and I could not stay in that bunker while people bled. The main hall had been transformed into a war zone, marble floors slick with blood, bullet holes pocked the walls, and shattered glass from the windows glittered like diamonds in the morning light that streamed through the damage. Two of Dante's men lay on makeshift gurneys, one with a shoulder wound that was bleeding heavily, and another with a leg injury that had already soaked through the tourniquet someone had applied. A gray-haired man in blood-spattered clothes was working on them with the calm efficiency of military medical training, and I moved to his side without introduction and began assessing the shoulder wound. "Dr. Chen," the man said, not looking up from the femoral artery he was clamping. "I am Dr. Petrov. Mr. Salvatore said you might emerge despite his orders to stay in the safe room." "I need irrigation and I need it now," I said, ignoring his comment as I cut away the wounded guard's shirt and exposed the entry wound. We worked in synchronized silence, two medical professionals falling into the familiar rhythm of trauma care, and I felt my mind compartmentalize everything else and focus only on the medicine. The shoulder wound was through and through, missing major vessels by centimeters, and I packed it and dressed it while Petrov stabilized the leg injury that was more serious than it initially appeared. The guard whose shoulder I had just saved gripped my hand weakly, his eyes glazed with pain and gratitude. "The doctor saved me," he said in heavily accented English, loud enough that the other guards heard. "Mr. Salvatore's angel." I felt Dante's presence behind me before I saw him, that awareness I was developing of exactly where he was in any room, and when I turned, he was watching me with an expression that made my breath catch. There was admiration there, respect, but also something deeper and more dangerous that I did not want to examine. "You never stop, do you?" he said quietly as I washed blood from my hands in a basin someone had brought. "Always saving people." "It is the only thing I know how to do," I replied. And it was true, the truest thing about me. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing my cheekbone, and I saw his feelings written plainly in those ice-blue eyes. Around us, his men were cleaning up the aftermath, removing bodies of the 8 attackers who had not survived, and I should have been horrified, but instead I felt strangely calm because this was Dante's world, and somehow I was becoming part of it. We stood in his study later that afternoon while repair crews worked to fix the bullet damage and clean blood from marble, and Dante sat on the edge of his desk, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his face, despite his controlled posture. "I have a proposal for you," he said, and his voice was careful in a way I had not heard before. "2 options, both genuine, and the choice is entirely yours." He pulled out files that he set on the desk between us. "I can relocate you and Jake with new identities, new lives somewhere far from here, where neither the Kozlov family nor anyone else in my world will ever find you. Switzerland or New Zealand, or anywhere you choose. Enough money to finish your medical training if you want, to give Jake the best education, to live comfortably without ever working again if that is what you prefer." His ice-blue eyes held mine with unsettling intensity. "Or you can stay here, work as my personal physician, be part of my world with all that entails." The choice hung between us like something physical, and I felt torn in directions I did not want to examine. The smart choice was obvious. Take the new identity and the safety of anonymity. Protect Jake from this violence and danger. Go back to a normal life, even if it was lived under a different name. But the pull I felt toward Dante was undeniable. This dangerous man who understood my grief and made me feel alive for the first time since David died. And this world that terrified me also made my blood sing in a way my careful hospital routine never had. "I want you to stay," Dante said quietly, vulnerability bleeding through his usual control. "But I will not trap you here, will not use fear or obligation to keep you. You saved my life, and I owe you freedom, not another cage." "Why do you want me to stay?" I asked, needing to hear him say it, needing to understand what I would be choosing. "Because when I look at you, I remember what it feels like to want something more than power," he said, his hand reaching out to catch mine. Because you see the man I am trying to become, instead of only the monster I have been. Because in 2 days you have made me feel more than I have felt in the 6 years since Sophia died. The afternoon light streamed through windows being replaced, and I thought about Jake's safety, whether running would truly protect him or just delay the inevitable, whether Dante's fortress was actually the safer choice. I thought about my small apartment and my overwhelming debt and the grinding exhaustion of my old life, and I thought about the way my heart raced when Dante touched me, the way I felt necessary and valued here in a way I had not felt since David was alive. The choice should have been impossible, but somehow it was simple. I asked Marco for information about Dante before I made my decision, needing to understand who I was potentially binding myself to, and to my surprise, he appeared an hour later with files that he spread across the library table, where afternoon light was beginning to fade into evening. "Mr. Salvatore authorized this," Marco said, his gruff voice holding something like approval. "He does not share this information with outsiders, but he wants you to see who he truly is." The files contained financial records and business documentation that showed a complex picture far different from what I expected. 60% of Dante's operations were completely legitimate now, shipping companies and import businesses and real estate holdings that operated entirely within the law, and the remaining 40% he was actively working to exit through careful negotiations and strategic partnerships. There were contracts with the FBI showing his cooperation in dismantling rival organizations, testimony he had provided that led to arrests of human traffickers and drug lords, evidence of a man trying to build something better from the foundation of violence he had inherited. Then I found the charitable donations, and my breath caught. Substantial anonymous gifts to hospitals throughout the city, including Mercy General where I worked, funding for trauma centers and emergency departments, and research into treating gunshot wounds. Scholarships in Sophia's name for disadvantaged students, hundreds of them over the past 6 years, full rides to college for kids who would never have had that chance. Construction of schools in neighborhoods ravaged by the same violence his world had created. "He is not a good man by your standards, Doctor," Marco said quietly, as I stared at the evidence of Dante's attempts at redemption. "But he is trying to be better. Since his sister died, he has been working to legitimize the business his father built, to exit the violence even though it makes him vulnerable to rivals who see it as weakness. The donations and scholarships were his way of honoring Sophia," Marco continued, "and you make him want to try harder. I watched him this morning when you were treating the wounded, and I saw something in his face I have not seen in years. Hope, maybe, or purpose beyond simple survival." The library had grown dim around us, and I sat surrounded by evidence of a man far more complex than the strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who commanded an army of killers. Dante was trying to change his legacy, trying to build something good from the blood and compromise, and the fact that he had authorized Marco to show me his vulnerability, his hopes, his redemption arc, meant he trusted me in a way he apparently trusted few people. My perception shifted completely as I closed the files, no longer seeing only the dangerous criminal, but also the man trying desperately to become someone his dead sister would have been proud of. I found Jake in his room that evening, packing his belongings into the designer luggage that had appeared along with everything else Dante had provided, and when I asked what he was doing, he turned to me with an expression far older than his 19 years. "I am going back to school," he said simply. "Dante has arranged security for me there, people who will keep me safe without being obvious about it, and I trust him to keep his word." I started to protest, but he held up a hand. "Maya, I have seen how you look at him. I have watched you come alive here in a way you have not been since David died. Our life before was just surviving, scraping by, you working yourself to exhaustion to keep us afloat. And here you seem to actually be living." His words hit me like a physical blow because I had not realized how transparent I had become, had not acknowledged even to myself that Dante had awakened something dormant in me, some capacity for feeling that I thought had died on that emergency room table 2 years ago. You saved me when Mom and Dad died, Jake continued, sitting on the edge of the bed that probably cost more than our entire apartment. You put your life on hold for 6 years to raise me, worked 3 jobs, and went to school and never complained once. You gave up your dreams so I could have mine, and I will never be able to repay that. But maybe it is time you did something for yourself, instead of always sacrificing for everyone else. It is not that simple, I said, but my voice lacked conviction, because part of me knew he was right. Isn't it? Jake asked, and his eyes held a wisdom that reminded me he was not a child anymore. That somewhere in the past 6 years, while I was busy protecting him, he had grown into a young man with his own insights. You love him, Maya. I can see it every time you say his name, every time he walks into a room. And unless I am completely blind, he loves you too. The words hung between us in the evening light, and I could not deny them, could not pretend that what I felt for Dante was simple gratitude, or Stockholm Syndrome, or anything other than the terrifying reality Jake had named. I do not know how to do this, I whispered. How to choose something dangerous instead of something safe. You stop at car accidents in the middle of the night, Jake said with a slight smile. You run toward danger when everyone else runs away. Choosing Dante is just another version of that. He zipped his suitcase and stood. I trust him to protect both of us, and I trust you to know your own heart. So stop trying to make the smart choice, and make the right one instead. The bittersweet recognition that my baby brother had grown up enough to give me permission to live my own life settled over me like a blanket. I went to Dante's study at sunset, when golden light streamed through the windows and painted everything in warm amber. And when he looked up from his desk, I saw hope and fear warring in his ice-blue eyes, like he already knew what I had come to say. I will stay, I said without preamble, and watched relief flash across his strikingly handsome face, so intense it was almost painful to witness. But I have conditions. His expression shifted to something careful, and I continued before I could lose my nerve. I continue working at the hospital with whatever security you deem necessary. I am not just ornamental or decorative. I need purpose and my own identity beyond being the woman you are protecting, and I have the freedom to leave if I choose, even though I am choosing to stay now. Dante stood slowly and moved around his desk, each step deliberate, and I held my ground even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. You understand what staying means, he said, stopping close enough that I could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes and smell cedar and leather. You will be a target always, not just from the Kozlov family, but from anyone who wants to hurt me, and there will be restrictions on your freedom no matter how much I wish otherwise. I have been a target since I saved you, I replied, lifting my chin. At least this way I am choosing it, choosing you, choosing this life with full knowledge of what it entails. Something blazed in his eyes, desire and possession, and something deeper that made my breath catch, and his hand came up to cup my face with a gentleness that contradicted every ruthless decision I had watched him make. Then choose me, Maya, he said, his voice dropping lower, rougher, fully and completely, with no more hesitation or doubt. The tension between us crackled like electricity in the golden light. All the awareness and attraction and connection we had been dancing around suddenly undeniable, and I felt the exact moment we crossed an invisible line from protection and gratitude into something far more dangerous. I choose you, I whispered, and his other hand came up to frame my face, his thumb tracing my lower lip. I agree to all your conditions, he said, his accent thickening with emotion. You will work at the hospital, you will have your own identity and purpose, you will have as much freedom as I can give you while keeping you safe. But understand that I am choosing you too, choosing to let you see the parts of myself I hide from everyone else, choosing to care about someone for the first time since Sophia died, knowing that caring makes me vulnerable. The acknowledgement of mutual wanting hung heavy in the air between us, the sunset painting us both in gold, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened next would change everything irrevocably. Dante closed the distance between us with deliberate slowness, giving me time to pull away or change my mind. And his eyes asked permission more clearly than words ever could, ice blue and burning with an intensity that made my knees weak. I nodded, barely a movement, and then his mouth was on mine and the world simply exploded. The kiss released all the tension of the past 2 days in a rushing wave. Everything we had been holding back and denying and dancing around suddenly unleashed, and it was gentle at first, almost reverent, his lips soft against mine like I was something precious that might break. Then I made a small sound in the back of my throat, and the kiss deepened, became consuming, his tongue sliding against mine in a way that sent heat pooling low in my belly and made my fingers tighten in the fabric of his shirt. His hands framed my face like I was the most valuable thing he had ever held, thumbs stroking my cheekbones, and I felt seen in a way I had not felt since David died, seen and wanted and chosen, not because I was convenient or useful, but because he could not help himself any more than I could. I pulled him closer by his shirt, eliminating even the breath of space between us, and felt the solid warmth of his body against mine, the rapid beat of his heart that matched my own frantic rhythm. "I have wanted this since I opened my eyes and saw you saving me," he said between kisses, his voice rough and his accent thick. "Since I watched you refuse to be intimidated by armed men, since I saw you choose medicine over fear every single time. I have wanted this since I admitted I was staying," I whispered back, my hands sliding up to tangle in his hair. "Since you told me about Sophia and I realized you understood the weight I carry." Years of loneliness fell away from both of us in that moment. All the careful walls we had built to protect ourselves from feeling too much crumbling under the force of this connection, neither of us had expected or planned. The sunset outside had turned to dusk, purple and deep blue bleeding across the sky, and somewhere in the estate I heard the distant sound of doors closing and footsteps fading as his staff gave us privacy. Dante's hands moved from my face to my waist, pulling me impossibly closer, and the kiss shifted again into something deeper and more primal, a claiming on both sides. This was not a conquest, or a transaction, or even simple attraction. This was two damaged people finding unexpected wholeness in each other, two survivors recognizing something essential in the other that made the risk of caring worth taking again. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back from this moment, no returning to the careful distance we had maintained before. We had crossed the line together, and whatever came next, we would face as something more than doctor and patient, more than protector and protected, something that felt dangerously close to partners in every sense of the word. Morning shattered our fragile peace when Marco burst into the breakfast room where Dante and I sat close enough that our shoulders touched, his expression grim in a way that made my stomach drop even before he spoke. "The Kozlov family has taken Alessandro Moretti," he said without preamble, and I watched Dante's entire body go rigid. "They are offering a trade, your ally for you, meeting tonight at the old shipping warehouse on Pier 17. Dante was on his feet immediately, his hand leaving mine as he transformed back into the cold strategist I had seen during the attack, and I followed him to the war room where maps and intelligence reports spread across a massive table like the guts of some mechanical beast. "It is obviously a trap," I said, panic clawing at my throat because I had just found him, just admitted what I felt, and now he might walk into his own execution. "You cannot go." "I must," Dante replied without looking at me, his fingers tracing routes on the map with tactical precision. "In my world, power is everything. Reputation, the willingness to face danger for your people. Show weakness and I lose it all, the respect of my men, the fear of my enemies, the ability to protect anyone, including you." Marco and the other men gathered around the table were discussing entry points and sniper positions and extraction protocols, their voices low and urgent, and the morning light streaming through the windows felt harsh and unforgiving, stripping away any illusion of safety. I watched Dante's face and saw something beneath his strategic calm, a flicker of fear that had nothing to do with his own survival and everything to do with leaving me unprotected. "Then I am coming with you," I said, and every man in the room went silent and turned to stare at me. "Absolutely not," Dante said, his voice sharp. "You will stay here where Marco can ensure your safety." "I stayed here during the last attack and watched men die on monitors," I countered, moving to stand beside him at the table. "You said I could have purpose, that I would not be ornamental, so let me be useful. I am a doctor, and if this goes badly, you will need medical support on site." Dante's jaw tightened, and I saw him warring with himself, the need to protect me battling against the recognition that I was right. "Maya, this is not a car accident or a controlled emergency room," he said quietly. "These are men who will kill you without hesitation, simply because you matter to me." "I know exactly what this is," I replied, holding his ice blue gaze. "And I am choosing to go anyway, because you matter to me too, and I will not sit safely in your fortress while you walk into a trap." The war room held its collective breath as Dante stared at me, and I saw the exact moment he made his decision, when his need to respect my choice won out over his instinct to lock me away from danger. I leaned over the map and traced the warehouse layout with my finger, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane. "I can be useful in a way Kozlov will not expect," I said, and felt every eye in the room turn toward me again. "I attend as your doctor, carrying my medical bag, which no one will question because you have a visible head injury that requires monitoring. Inside the bag we hide weapons, tracking devices, whatever Marco thinks is necessary, and I become an unexpected element in their calculations because they will see a doctor as harmless." Dante's expression hardened immediately, and he shook his head. "No, absolutely not. You are not walking into a trap carrying hidden weapons like some kind of operative." "You said I belong in your world," I countered, my voice getting fiercer. "Prove you meant it. Prove this is not just pretty words about partnership while you lock me away like a protected bird in a cage." "I am leverage either way, Dante, whether I stay here or come with you. So at least if I am there, I can be an active participant instead of a pawn." Marco made a considering sound, and when Dante shot him a glare, the older man shrugged. "She has a point," Marco said in his gruff way. "Kozlov will expect you to bring security, but a doctor is unusual enough to make him curious. Might give us an advantage if he underestimates her presence." I watched Dante war with himself, his hands braced on the table, knuckles white with tension, and I knew he was torn between his need to keep me safe and his recognition that I deserved agency in my own fate. "You understand you may have to hurt someone," he said finally, turning to face me fully. "This is not abstract, Maya. You may have to use those hidden weapons. You may have to make choices that violate everything you have been trained to do." "I have taken an oath to heal," I said, meeting his ice-blue eyes without flinching. "But I will break it to protect you because some things matter more than oaths." The words hung between us heavy with meaning, and I saw his resolve crumble, saw him make the choice to trust me as his partner rather than simply his responsibility. The afternoon dissolved into preparation, Marco fitting me with a Kevlar vest thin enough to hide under my clothes, going through my medical bag to create hidden compartments for a small pistol and tracking devices and a syringe filled with fast-acting sedative. Dante watched the whole process with an expression that cycled between fear and pride and something deeper, and when Marco pronounced me ready, as evening began to fall, Dante pulled me aside. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," he said quietly, his hand cupping my face. and the most terrifying because you make me want things I cannot afford to want. I kissed him then, hard and fast, tasting his fear and his trust and his desperate hope that this plan would not end with one of us dying. And when I pulled back, I saw my own determination reflected in his eyes. The abandoned warehouse at Pier 17 smelled of rust and river water and old oil, the kind of place where terrible things happened in darkness, and nobody ever found the bodies, and I stayed close to Dante's side as we entered with only Marco and 3 other men, because those were the terms Kozlov had demanded. The space was cavernous and echoing, our footsteps ringing on concrete floors, and harsh industrial lights created pools of illumination, separated by deep shadows where anything could be hiding. Kozlov waited in the center of the warehouse with at least 20 armed men arrayed behind him like a show of force, and bound to a chair between them was Alessandro Moretti, Dante's ally, his face swollen and bloodied from a beating that made my medical training catalog injuries automatically even through my fear. I wore my white doctor's coat over the Kevlar vest that felt suffocatingly tight, my medical bag clutched in hands I forced to remain steady, and I could feel the weight of the hidden pistol against my hip like a brand. "The little doctor," Kozlov said, his Russian accent thick as his eyes found me, and recognition flashed across his brutal features. "Your savior. How touching that you bring her to your execution, Dante Salvatore. She is here to tend my friend after you release him," Dante replied, his voice controlled and cold, every inch the powerful man who had built an empire, and I marveled at how he could sound so calm when I could feel the tension radiating from his body. Kozlov laughed, a sound like grinding metal, and gestured to his men who shifted their weapons in our direction. "She is here because you are foolish enough to care for someone, and that ends tonight along with your interference in my operations." I felt Kozlov's gaze rake over me like something physical and invasive, assessing me as leverage and weakness, and I understood with crystalline clarity that Dante's worst fear was materializing in front of us. My fingers tightened on my medical bag, and I thought of Marco positioned outside with the rest of Dante's forces, of the tracking devices hidden in my bag that were feeding our location to them, of the plan we had made that depended on me staying calm and alert. Terror clawed at my throat, but I forced my expression to remain professional and detached. Just a doctor brought to treat the wounded. Nothing more threatening than that. Dante's hand brushed mine for just a moment, a fleeting contact that somehow steadied me, and I saw him playing the game with Kozlov, negotiating and stalling while the pieces moved into position around us in shadows and silence. Kozlov pulled his gun in one smooth motion and aimed it directly at Dante's chest, and I moved without thinking, stepping between them with my medical bag raised like a shield, even though I knew it would not stop a bullet. "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through the warehouse echo with a clarity that surprised me. "I have information you want, medical records that prove his vulnerabilities, details about his other operations that only his personal physician would know." Kozlov's finger hesitated on the trigger, and I saw Dante in my peripheral vision, his face transforming into something between fury and terror, but I kept my eyes locked on the Russian mobster and continued speaking. "You kill him now and you get revenge, one dead rival. But I give you the information, and you can dismantle everything he has built, destroy his entire empire piece by piece, which is worth more to you." I was bluffing entirely, had no such information and no intention of betraying Dante even if I did. But I had watched Kozlov's eyes when he talked about Dante's interference in his operations, and I knew greed when I saw it. The man wanted more than simple murder. He wanted total domination, and I was offering him exactly that, wrapped in the credible package of a doctor who would have access to everything. "Show me," Kozlov said, lowering his gun slightly, and I felt Dante's hand grip my arm hard enough to bruise, but I shook him off gently. "Release the ally first," I said, gesturing to the beaten man tied to the chair. "Insurance that you will not kill us all immediately after I show you what I have." My medical bag has the files on a secure tablet, but I need to know you are negotiating in good faith. I spoke with the clinical precision I used when explaining treatment options to difficult patients, projecting calm authority, even as my heart hammered against my ribs hard enough that I was sure everyone could hear it. Dante was vibrating with controlled rage beside me, and I knew he understood what I was doing, creating time and distraction for Marco's team to move into position. But the cost of that understanding was written in every tense line of his body. Kozlov studied me with eyes like chips of dirty ice, and I held his gaze without flinching. One doctor to one brutal killer, appealing to his greed because greed was predictable, and greed could be manipulated. Around us, the warehouse had gone completely still, 20 guns pointed at us, and Dante's few men outnumbered but alert, everyone waiting to see which way this moment would tip. The standoff stretched, and I was aware of every sound, the lap of river water against the dock pilings outside, the distant wail of a ship horn, the rasp of Kozlov's breathing as he weighed revenge against the promise of total victory. Finally, he gestured, and two of his men moved to cut Alessandro free from the chair, and I felt something uncoil slightly in my chest, because Kozlov had taken the bait, and now we just had to survive long enough for the trap to spring. As Kozlov's men cut the ropes binding Alessandro and hauled him to his feet, I reached into my medical bag with steady fingers and found the smoke grenade Marco had nestled between bandages and antiseptic, pulled the pin the way he had shown me during our brief training session, and threw it directly at Kozlov's feet, where it erupted in thick white smoke that filled the warehouse like fog rolling in from the ocean. Chaos exploded instantly, shouts in Russian and Italian, the crack of gunfire as Dante's backup team breached through windows and loading dock doors with the precision of a military operation, and I hit the concrete floor hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. Dante was on top of me immediately, his body a shield covering mine, while bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off metal supports with sounds like angry wasps. And through the smoke I could see muzzle flashes like fireworks, and hear Marco's voice shouting coordinates over the radio. "When this is over, we are having a serious conversation about you risking your life," Dante growled against my ear, his weight pressing me flat, and I would have laughed if I could breathe. "When this is over, you are going to thank me," I managed to gasp back, and then he was pulling me up, and we were moving low and fast toward cover behind a stack of shipping containers. The smoke was starting to clear in patches, and through it I saw Kozlov stumbling toward us, his gun raised, murder written across his face as he realized I had played him. He lunged for me, his meaty hand closing around my arm, yanking me away from Dante with enough force to make my shoulder scream, and his gun came up toward my head. My medical training took over in pure instinct, my free hand diving into the bag still clutched against my chest, fingers finding the syringe of fast-acting sedative Marco had prepared, and I drove it into Kozlov's neck with all the precision I used starting IVs, depressing the plunger completely. His eyes went wide with shock and rage, the gun wavering, and I watched him struggle against the drug flooding his system, his grip on my arm loosening as his knees buckled. He went down like a felled tree, unconscious before he hit the concrete, and I stood over him shaking with adrenaline and the recognition that I had just used my healing skills to disable a man who would have killed me without hesitation. Dante appeared through the thinning smoke, blood on his shirt that I hoped was not his, and pulled me against him hard enough to hurt. Around us the firefight was ending, Kozlov's men surrendering or dead, and Marco's team securing the warehouse with brutal efficiency. "You are extraordinary," Dante said into my hair, his voice rough with fear and pride, and something that sounded like awe. Absolutely terrifying and completely extraordinary. I clung to him and felt the partnership we had forged in violence and trust, proven now in fire and smoke and the kind of choices that changed who you were forever. Back at the estate after Dr. Petrov had treated our minor injuries, and Marco had taken Alessandro to a guest room to recover, and Kozlov had been secured in whatever holding facility Dante maintained for enemies who needed questioning. I found myself alone with Dante in his bedroom as rain began to tap against the windows like it had that first night when everything changed. He pulled me into his arms with a fierceness that bordered on desperation, his hands running over my back and shoulders like he needed to confirm I was solid and real and whole. And I felt him, shaking in a way I had never seen from this man who commanded armies and faced assassination attempts with cold calculation. "You could have died," he said against my hair, his voice breaking on the words. "When Kozlov grabbed you, I saw every nightmare I have carried since Sophia was killed, every fear I have spent 6 years building walls against, and I could have lost you because I let you walk into that warehouse. But you did not," I said, pulling back to look at his face where his ice blue eyes were bright with unshed tears and raw emotion. "We survived together, because we trusted each other and worked as partners the way you said we would." The adrenaline was crashing through both our systems now, fear transforming into something else, something desperate and consuming. And when Dante kissed me, it tasted of relief and terror and the recognition of how close we had come to losing everything we had barely begun to build. "I love you," he said when we broke apart, the words spilling from him like a confession he could no longer contain. I did not think I could feel this again after Sophia died. Did not think I would allow myself to care enough about anyone to give them this kind of power over me. But I love you, Maya, and I cannot hide it anymore. The declaration hit me with the force of truth I had been denying to myself for days, the recognition that what I felt for him had long since passed attraction or gratitude, or even the connection of shared grief and become something far more permanent and terrifying. "I love you too," I whispered, my own tears finally falling. "God help me, I love you. And I should be terrified of what that means. But all I feel is certainty." His hands framed my face, like I was the most precious thing he had ever held, and outside the rain intensified until it drummed against the windows, loud enough to drown out the rest of the world, leaving us in a cocoon of safety where nothing existed except this moment and this truth we had finally spoken aloud. We had survived violence and danger, and the worst our respective worlds could throw at us, and somehow in the wreckage we had found each other, two broken people becoming whole through the simple revolutionary act of choosing love, despite every reason not to. 6 months after that night in the warehouse, I drove through the estate gates after a 12-hour shift at Mercy General, my discreet security team following at a respectful distance in their black SUV. And the sight of the house lit up against the winter darkness made something warm unfurl in my chest, because this was home now, in a way my cramped apartment had never been. Dante met me at the door like he did every evening I worked, pulling me into his arms and kissing me thoroughly before asking about my day, and I told him about the cardiac arrest I had helped resuscitate, and the teenager with appendicitis, and the endless parade of humanity that flowed through the emergency room. We had dinner in the smaller dining room that Rosa had helped me decorate, casual and warm, rather than the formal space we used for business associates. And Jake was visiting from college for the weekend, which meant the meal was full of his stories about engineering projects and campus life, and the girl he was seeing who made him blush when Dante teased him about it. "You two are disgustingly happy," Jake said, watching Dante reach for my hand across the table with the unconscious ease of habit, and I laughed because it was true and I was not ashamed of it. "After everything we have earned it," I replied, thinking of the violence and fear and impossible choices that had brought us to this peaceful moment. Dante lifted my hand to his lips, his ice blue eyes holding mine with an intensity that still made my breath catch after 6 months together. "Every day with her is earned," he said quietly. "I do not take it for granted, not after coming so close to losing her." We were planning the annual charity gala for Sophia's foundation, an event that had grown from a small fundraiser into a major occasion that drew politicians and business leaders and raised millions for scholarships and schools. And I watched Dante discuss seating arrangements with the passionate focus he brought to everything he cared about. His business was 75% legitimate now, more every month, and the violence that had defined his world was fading as he built something his sister would have been proud of. Marco joined us for coffee, gruff and protective as always, and Rosa fussed over Jake like the grandmother he had never had, and I looked around the table at this found family we had created from blood and choice and survival. I was Dr. Maya Chen at the hospital where my colleagues respected my skills and never asked about the armed men who waited in the parking lot. And I was Maya Salvatore in waiting here where I helped Dante navigate the legitimate world and reminded him that redemption was possible. Both halves of my life had integrated into something whole, and I was happier than I had been since before David died. Maybe happier than I had ever been, because this happiness was built on truth rather than illusion. Late that night, after Jake had gone to bed and the house had settled into quiet, Dante and I walked the estate grounds under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch, our breath forming clouds in the December air. I told him about a patient I had treated that afternoon, a man in a car accident who had been bleeding heavily from a head wound, and how I had thought of that rain-soaked street where everything changed, where I stopped to help a strikingly handsome stranger and set in motion a series of events that had transformed my entire existence. That was the night my life truly began, Dante said softly, his arm around my waist as we walked along the lake where moonlight turned the water to silver. Not when I inherited my father's empire, or when I survived the attack that killed him, but when I opened my eyes and saw you saving me with steady hands and a compassion I did not deserve. We stopped near the dock where the water lapped gently against the pilings, and I could see our reflections in the dark surface. Two figures merged into one, and Dante turned to face me with an expression that made my heart race. "You saved my life that night on the street," he said, taking both my hands in his. "But every day since you have given me a reason to live it, shown me that redemption is possible, and that love can exist even in the darkness I inhabit." His voice dropped lower, thick with emotion. "Marry me, Maya. Build this new world with me. Let me spend the rest of my life earning the gift you gave me when you refused to walk past a dying man in a crashed car." The proposal was simple and heartfelt, and everything I had never known I wanted. Not because I had saved him, but because he saw me completely, all my damage and strength and stubborn determination to heal a broken world one patient at a time. "Yes," I said, the word coming out fierce and certain. "Always, yes." He pulled a ring from his pocket, a sapphire the exact color of his eyes surrounded by diamonds that caught the starlight, and slid it onto my finger where it felt right in a way nothing had felt right since David died. Around us the estate stretched peaceful and secure, the helicopters that had brought me here now just part of the landscape. Vehicles I used without fear, because they represented not kidnapping, but the lengths Dante would go to protect what mattered to him. We had come full circle from violence to love, from that desperate rescue on a rain-slicked street to this moment of choosing a future together. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that every impossible choice and terrifying moment had been worth it to arrive here, engaged to a man who understood my wounds because they mirrored his own, building a life that honored both the people we had lost and the second chance we had found in each other.